Hello and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. The Byline Times, it's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, prosperity or austerity. Rachel Reeves has told the House of Commons in her first major speech as Chancellor that the Conservatives covered up the full extent of the UK's budget deficit, and that since taking office, Labour has discovered a £22 billion black hole this year in the nation's finances. Tory leadership contender Robert Jenrick has accused her of being like a dodgy car mechanic who gives you a quote, only to claim they discovered more repairs are needed once you've handed over your keys and they've got under the bonnet. Rachel Reeves says some unfunded projects will be scrapped altogether, including a road tunnel under Stonehenge, while millions of pensioners will miss out on winter fuel payments, which are to become means tested. Teachers and NHS workers are to receive a 5.5% pay rise. Prison and police officers will get an uplift too, whilst junior doctors have been offered a backdated 22% increase, which is, according to Reeves' predecessor Jeremy Hunt, one of the reasons for the budget gap that she says she has discovered. We're joined by Dr. Linda Prieg. Linda is Head of Economics at the New Economics Foundation, and Pranesh Narayanan, who is a research fellow at the IPPR think tank. Lydia, let me start with you and asking you first off, Rachel Reeves, is she trying to smear the reputation of her predecessor, or is it really credible that the public finances are that much worse than Labour expected to find?
Well, look, I mean, obviously, all politicians love to smear the reputations of their predecessors. There are many things she mentioned in the speech that I feel like it's hard to claim is new information. So, for example, she talked about the impact of inflation on government departments and their spending plans. And this is something that economists have been talking about for really quite a long time now, basically since the cost of living crisis started. So I think you definitely can't present that as a bolt from the blue. Similarly, you know, we know with big infrastructure projects, they often run over and are insufficiently funded. This is a long-standing problem with big infrastructure projects under multiple governments. So whilst it's good if projects are being more sensibly costed, it's probably not completely new information either. But on the other hand, obviously, you know, I don't have the behind-the-scenes knowledge that she does about who disclosed what when, etc. And she's definitely laying the groundwork for policies, difficult policies that she's going to announce in the upcoming budget in the autumn, which are all going to be about trying to meet the commitments she's made on taxes and fiscal rules whilst trying not to preside over 5 years of declining public services, which is altogether quite a difficult package to achieve.
Pranesh Narayanan, they are talking about no increases to income tax, no increases to VAT. These were the promises that were made at the general election by the Labour Party. But if you factor in this £22 billion additional spending that Rachel Reeves is going to have to find, it leaves very little room for manoeuvre, at least in the world of conventional economics, which is one that Rachel Reeves seems wedded to.
I mean, that is true. There is a big gap in the sort of black hole that Rachel Reeves says she's identified, and the measures she's taken in terms of cuts only amounted to about £5 billion. So yeah, there is still a big gap to be plugged. The announcement today was basically on current spending, and we know that the sort of fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves has talked about has made some reservations for capital spending. So, you know, they'll be treated slightly differently to the types of spending that they've announced today. And so the interesting thing to look forward to at that budget is really whether they are bold in tackling some of the long-term investment problems whilst plugging the gap in the short term. And of course, there are sort of options to fairly increase the level of taxation on people without impacting working people. If you look to things like capital gains tax or indeed inheritance tax, there's ways you can allow those with the broader shoulders to contribute more in rebuilding the economy.
Yeah, I suppose the question is whether additional taxation, if derived from those sources, will simply be used to to plug the black hole, whether it will be used to fund these pay increases. No doubt welcomed by nurses, by doctors, by prison officers, by police officers, by NHS staff, and so on. But will this be used for the growth of the economy, which Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have put at the heart of their plan?
I mean, I would say that there is room to borrow more. And I think that the way they've set up their fiscal rules, or they're intending to set up their fiscal rules, might allow them to actually borrow to fund that investment. And certainly that's our position, is we can borrow more to invest in these longer term infrastructure projects. And in fact, the UK has the lowest levels of investment in the G7, in G7 group of advanced economies. And so really getting that rate of investment up is crucial for actually delivering on their mission to grow the economy. So I think there are obviously choices to be made about which projects that they invest in, and making sure that it's going to be the most value for money projects that they borrow to invest in. But there should be some consideration of borrowing. It wouldn't necessarily have to be funded by taxation.
Lydia, we've spoken on this podcast on many occasions about the impacts of austerity, the impact of that on the health service, and the impact of that on economic growth for the country as a whole. The government has said it wants to grow the economy, but on the face of it anyway, this statement from Rachel Reeves appears to be setting the ground for austerity 2.0, or am I missing something?
I mean, large parts of the speech definitely had a very austerity feel to it. I think you've hit the nail on the head in your previous question. We're all focusing on this 22 billion, but actually this is just sort of a new funding gap that's been identified. This is on top of the existing problems that we already knew were there. So for example, we already know in order to meet the fiscal rules, unprotected departments, which is departments that aren't health, education or defence, unprotected departments are going to have some quite sizable real-term cuts built in that you would need about sort of 24 billion a year extra just to not have those cuts. So just to effectively stand still and not have cuts going out to 2028, 29. Then on top of that, we've got the pressures of an aging population, which means increasing spending. We've got other pressures like climate change. Plus, as you've just rightly flagged just now, we've also got long-standing chronic underinvestment problems, which have happened because these budgets have been squeezed, and it's always easier to cut the capital, the investment spending than the day-to-day spending because it's politically easier. People don't notice it straight away. And so we keep not investing, and it just means slowly over time, all these systems become less and less efficient. So there's far more money that needs to be raised in order to sort out this problem than just the 22 billion that Rachel Reeves has highlighted. And I think that's got to come through a mixture of tax and borrowing. I mean, great if Rachel Reeves is going to be looking at some of these progressive wealth tax changes around, say, capital gains tax or around pensions relief. That's all very promising. But we have to be realistic about how much money just those changes can make, like decent sums. Let's not scoff at them. Let's do it. But to solve the scale of problem we've got, you need to be looking at the big taxes. You need to be looking at income tax, VAT, and national insurance.
The very things that Rachel Reeves has said that she will not increase. It was an election pledge.
Exactly. And then on the borrowing side of things, because I agree that we can borrow more for the right things. And we've seen that the markets are prepared to accept, and the OBR are prepared to accept borrowing for example, investment that people believe is actually going to grow the economy. But the fiscal rules, as Rachel Reeves has currently laid out them, I think still bind the UK in quite a straitjacket. So for example, there's going to be a lot of discussion about, well, what constitutes investment, for example, like social investments, etc., could be excluded. There's problems with just having any kind of simple measure of like debt to GDP or anything else to GDP. It's very simplistic, when actually the question of how much an economy can sustainably borrow is very complicated macroeconomic problem that can't really be simplistically reduced to a crude rule. So you've got that. Plus there's other problems like the fact that the OBR are asked to only do forecasting over a 5-year period, which means that some of the benefits that you would get from some of the investment wouldn't start to materialize in their forecasts. So for example, the OBR's own analysis says that if you take action against climate change now, it will have a lesser overall effect on public finances, i.e. if you don't take action, the impact on the debt to GDP ratio down the line will be far worse. But they can't take factors like that into account when analysing budgets because they can only look at this 5-year time frame. So there's all sorts of issues with Rachel Reeves's current pledges on both the borrowing and the tax side that she really needs to address if she's going to try to sort of steer the UK economy out of this stagnation and / decline course that we seem to currently be on.
Yeah, and you say that people, in a sense, don't notice the capital investment that hasn't been made. I mean, clearly, if something hasn't been there, you don't notice that it isn't there by definition. But some of the spending that Rachel Reeves will be considering are the 40 new hospitals promised by Boris Johnson. Now, as we all know, because Johnson was mocked at the time for making the claim that they were 40 new hospitals, actually a significant number of those hospitals are not new at all, but they are in fact rebuilds of existing facilities. So if those facilities are there already and they're crumbling, people will notice that, won't they? If HS2, which wasn't mentioned in her speech in Parliament, does end up stopping at Old Oak Common rather than going to Euston, it will arguably make a mockery of the many billions of pounds that have already been spent on that project, and will lead people to question whether Labour is serious about tackling what many people would see as the crisis on the railways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't hide like decades of chronic underinvestment, right? I mean, the chickens are coming home to roost. Everybody knows, right? None of this is a secret. Rachel Reeves is acting at the moment like she thinks she can politically preside over 5 years of continuing crumbling public services. And I have big questions about politically whether it is possible for the Labour Party to do that. She's almost certainly not going to make the big tweaks that I'd like to see to her taxation pledges and her fiscal rule pledges in this upcoming October budget, because it's just too soon. But I also fail to believe that we're not going to see those changes over the course of the 5-year Parliament, because just the alternative is, I would imagine, just publicly completely unacceptable. Polling data demonstrates that people want functioning public services, and nobody thinks our public services are currently functioning.
I definitely agree in terms of the scale of the problem that we face. I mean, there's definitely a real need from both an economic and political perspective to get these things going again. I would say that things like public sector pay are positive signs, because a lot of the issues in delivering healthcare and in schools, things like that, were held back by issues with staff retention, with strikes, and general feeling of unhappiness amongst public sector workers. And those steps are positive, but I agree that there is still a lot of work left to do, especially given the status of the UK as one of the lowest investing economies in the G7.
Yeah, I just wondered, Pranesh, where the improvement in the economy is going to come from. Labour are making great play of the fact that they are stable and that they are competent, and that government won't be a car crash as it was at various occasions under Conservatives, particularly under Liz Truss. That will help. There's no question about that. But in the short term, how are you going to trigger the increase in productivity needed in order to generate more money for public services? Is there any alternative to what Lydia suggested, which is raising income tax, which is raising VAT, which is raising national insurance?
I would say that there are lots of reforms that can be done. I think that the level of taxation does need to increase in order to fund these things, but there are also things that the government can do effectively, such as a bold industrial strategy that actually coordinates policies to sort of deliver growth that has been absent, where under a sort of Conservative government, we've had too many growth plans, too many chopping and changing of the way the Conservative governments actually wanted to govern the economy. And having some stability, especially following the spectacle of Brexit, will help crowd in investment from the private sector. It remains to be seen how much investment that will crowd in, and without further investment being backed up by the government. But I think things like that, a sort of mission-oriented approach to government in terms of the way they are really prioritizing a few objectives to deliver, I think that will help as well focus policymaking on things that really matter.
Lydia suggested as well we need to look at the rules that Rachel Reeves is imposing on herself. Is the scope there to borrow to invest rather than borrowing to pay, for example, for benefits?
There definitely is a role for changing the way you think about fiscal rules. financial markets are pretty sophisticated players. They're not just looking at a number on a spreadsheet and saying, oh, this meets the fiscal rule, therefore it's okay. They're really digging into the details of what the government's announcing. The reason why the Liz Truss fiasco happened was because they made unfunded tax cuts and they borrowed to do that. And that was clearly a ridiculous use of a government borrowing, but it wouldn't be the end of the world if debt it was going up, if that debt was being used to finance investments in infrastructure, because that adds to the public sector balance sheet, that adds to the economy's productive capacity. I'd also say things like GB Energy could make a difference with more public ownership of the energy system, allowing profits to be retained within the public sector and reinvested in more energy infrastructure. There's some steps they've already taken to address the situation without reforming the fiscal rules, but you could reform the fiscal rules and improve things significantly.
I can imagine the frustration of people in various parts of the country hearing that, for example, a railway restoration fund has been axed. This is a fund to try and restore railways to areas that had lost their railways under the beaching cuts. Improving connectivity in the country is surely got to be one of the most important ways of boosting economic activity and also helping the less well-off parts of the country.
I think a glimmer of hope on that front is the fact that obviously Labour did very, very well with regards to the mayoral elections. So it's now got this quite large contingent of influential mayors, and these people have the ability to be a reasonably influential force within the Labour Party, and they also have the ability to maybe be a bit more independently minded than your average MP. And so hopefully that will be a force within the Labour Party putting pressure on Rachel Reeves to say, look, we need this investment spending. The amount of investment in public transport across the country is hugely unequal, with obviously some parts getting way more than others, and this urgently needs to be addressed if you want to deliver on your growth pledges. So hopefully those mayors will be able to play an important kind of political role within the Labour Party to try to get that funding.
And just one final thought, Lydia, we've touched on this earlier, but people are so important if you're trying to grow an economy. And in various parts of the public sector, particularly the NHS, the Conservative government had successfully got the backs up of various groups, including junior doctors who have now been offered this backdated 22% pay increase. You'd expect the prison officers and the police to be on side. They've been given a pay increase, and teachers who were threatening to strike appear to have been appeased by a 5.5% pay increase. And there will be benefits in that there will not be disruption going forward, hopefully, in those sectors. And if you've got happy, contented workforces, that is going to feed through. It may take a while, but that is going to feed through in terms of benefits to the economy and benefits to how people feel their public services are doing.
Yeah, and obviously, as was flagged earlier, that was one of the good bits of the speech. We are going to see these desperately needed public sector pay rises, because at the end of the day, we've got tons of unfilled vacancies in things like nursing and midwifery and teaching, like really vital, essential public services that we frankly just, we need to fill these posts, and we need to pay what's required to fill these posts so that we can have a basic level of functioning as a society. So really positive to see that as a step change. It's just a shame that it appears to be at least part funded out of departments having to find efficiency savings.
So what are we saying, Lydia? Are we saying austerity or prosperity, or is it just too early to say?
I mean, that speech and tone felt very austerity, but obviously, we've got to wait until the budget for details around what she's going to do around the tax front, for example, and if she's going to make any slight tweaks to the fiscal rules. So to a certain extent, the jury is still out, but the initial signs are concerning.
The tone was very austerity, but yeah, I would say let's wait and see what happens in the budget, and indeed the spending review that Rachel Reeves announced at the same time. So we're not just going to get a sense of what is going to happen in the next year, we're also going to get a sense of what they're planning to do over 3 years, so most of the parliament. I'm sort of hopeful that a lot of the decisions they'll make within that process will be positive, but it sort of remains to be seen whether it's going to meet the scale of the challenge involved.
Pranesh, thank you very much indeed. Thanks also to Linda Prieg, the head of economics at the New Economics Foundation. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This has been the Byline podcast, produced by me in Birmingham for Byline Audio. If you don't know what Byline Audio is, it's our fantastic selection of podcasts. Head over to bylineaudio.com to find out more. You'll find out details of the brilliant, funny, myth-busting utter bollocks with John Mitchinson and Otto English and loads of other great podcasts as well. And if you sign up for a premium membership, you get loads of exclusive content, including an ad-free version of this podcast. So do head over to bylineaudio.com. We'll see you again very soon. But for now, thank you. Cheers and bye-bye.
Byline.